Welcome to today's edition of the Human School's Mindshift Cards Conversations, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. In each of these episodes, we model brief inquiry conversations around one of our Mindshift cards in the Human School Mindshift Cards pack. If you'd like to check out those Mindshift Cards pack, you can find them at thehuman.school. In this episode, our question comes from the Objector compass point. And our question is really around storytelling. And the story that we would like to tell tonight is, think of a time where you or someone you know chose to be passively compliant instead of actively curious. And then to kind of consider how might it have looked or sounded or felt different if that person or you had been actively curious in that scenario. So I'm wondering, Randy, if you've got a story to tell first.
So this prompt brings to mind a time in my career when I was an instructional technology specialist. And one of the big takeaways from working in that position for 7 years was you can learn a lot from bad leadership. And I had a supervisor at the time who did not like any of us in the role of instructional technology specialist. They were not an advocate for technology. This was back in probably like the early 2000s. Was not an advocate for technology, didn't really support us, and demonstrated some pretty bad leadership across the years. So at the time, I had a laptop, and the laptop died. I needed a new laptop. Well, I was told that I was not going to get a laptop, and my role at the time was to support all the teachers in 2 middle schools and a high school. And I was not allowed to replace my laptop. And I was sort of like, okay. I was very passively compliant, and I was passively compliant largely, and I would probably do it differently, but largely because it was just too much friction to push back and to be curious and to say, like, can you help me understand? Why am I not allowed to have a laptop? Like, I am supposed to be supporting teachers in using technology. And I was told that in lieu of a laptop, I was going to be able to use the desktop computers in the libraries in each of the buildings. So for a year before I left, I actually ended up, my computer was in the library. So, it was my last year. Yep, it was my last year. And I think at that point, I probably knew it was time to move on, and it just was not worth pushing back and not being curious. And I was just like, just push through and that was probably the wrong thing to do. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people out there that feel like they have poor leadership that's supervising them, and it's just not worth pushing back on. So I've been there. 20 years later, I'd probably change it. I'd probably respond a little bit differently, but that's my story.
Rachel, do you want to share next?
Sure. So one of the times that I've watched people do it, and then similar to what you said, Randy, I made some choices that are not what I would like to have done, but we had the opportunity about 5 years ago to rewrite curriculum for our English department in secondary. And it was a big deal because our curriculum had been scripted for years. And we worked really hard to convince upper administration that we were going to align things to standards, and we were going to do as good, if not better, a job in meeting the standards and having students be successful with curriculum that we wrote instead of a scripted curriculum. And when it came time to actually make some decisions about curriculum, it was surprising to me. There was kind of a stark divide between colleagues of mine who wanted to keep the scripted curriculum. They didn't want to explore any other kind of scripted curriculum. They wanted to keep exactly what they had because they didn't want to have to write anything new because they were too tired. And then colleagues that wanted to have the opportunity to write their own curriculum, but that in reality it was not writing it. It was doing what they had done for a long time that they had enjoyed and getting rid of the stuff that they didn't like. And I remember feeling really surprised because I was so excited to write curriculum and really look at data and student feedback and parent feedback and all the options, and then think about, all the different ways that we could do this. And I remember us getting really sort of stuck in conversations about who was going to get to read which book and who was going to get to teach which book. And that went on forever. And my compliance was the part of me that wants to be a people pleaser, translates that often to not being disagreeable at all. And so I pushed in small ways, tried to increase some of the diversity of text or some of the recency of the readings, but really just sort of let it go. Because I didn't want to rock the boat too hard with my colleagues. And I could feel that even the little bit I was pushing around the text selection was stressful. But I remember just being really surprised because I knew how I felt, and I made a mistake in assuming how other people were going to feel. I didn't do a good job in being curious ahead of time, clearly. And yeah, even now, I feel still surprised at the choice to just continue on the same path, even though people were unhappy and they didn't like it. They wanted to stick with what they knew and not ask questions, not be curious, not try something new. And then I didn't do a great job of trying to be curious about that, and then trying to kind of push people a little bit in areas that they could have been perhaps pushed, because then I didn't want to rock the boat either.
A connection that I'm making is I'm working my way. I'm almost done with Dan Pink's Power of Regret, and both of you tell stories that have a little bit of a tinge of regret. And one of the things that he talks about in the text is how, and this just should come as no surprise, most people regret the things they don't do more than the things that they do. So like the regret is not the active part, it's the passive part. It's the choosing to not act upon it. I have a bunch of stories I'd love to tell, but I think the one that I think hopefully will move our conversation forward is kind of the tail end of Rachel, which is that my tendency is when I perceive that people aren't interested or they're not curious in me, I will reject and not be curious about them. So I take my ball and go home. And I can think of times working with, some specific leaders who it was really important for me, for whatever reason, to get their approval. And so what that did was my need for them to approve of me had me not sharing my thoughts or sharing my opinions because I thought that they would be in direct conflict with those people. But over time, because I was constantly falling into that trap of not sharing and what my perception of compliance, what they were looking for, I grew so resentful of them as people and as leaders that I stopped even trying to be curious about them, or even when I thought that they were making decisions that were not in the best interest of kids or the organization. I didn't feel the need to be compliant. I chose it because I was just so angry and resentful that they weren't interested in my perspective, but also that I was choosing at that point to not share it. So, without giving a specific example, like I could just think of situations where, we were trying to solve a challenge collectively, and it was clear that there was a perspective and that the ask, could you help me to understand, was not being met with very good feedback. The desire to share a why was not there. And so it just stopped asking over time. So what I'm trying to say is, like, I think that we've heard, the way that I connect to this is that, Rachel's story is more of a choice through kind of like trying to feel out like where people were at and not wanting to rock the boat. Mine comes from a place of not wanting to rock the boat, but beyond that, a place of like anger and animosity to where like I was actively choosing to not be curious about decisions or the people themselves. And so unhealthy situation. So
I know it's only 3 stories, but hearing these 3 stories makes me wonder, people that choose to be compliant as opposed to curious, is it because they don't know what to do or how to do it, or that they do know and they just go, screw it, I'm not going down that road? And I think each of us has a little bit of a different variation on that, but I'm wondering, we're only 3 stories, but I'm wondering what most other people would do, because I don't know how curious we as educators tend to be. Like, is that a muscle that we have exercised and know how to use? Also thinking of role models, not only role models in school, but just role models in society. Yeah. How much curiosity do we see from people on the news?
I'll give you an example of like a thing that I loved as a classroom teacher that many teachers would not have loved. At least, again, I'm generalizing, so that's maybe unfair, but I loved when kids asked me, why do we have to know this, or why are we studying this? Like, I loved the challenge. And I told them, if I can't give you a reasonable answer to that question, then we're going to stop, because I clearly haven't thought. I don't know that most, I guess the thing that I connected to immediately, Randy, in your question was the role of authority, and how authority and power play themselves out in a traditional system. So I do think it's both. I think that most educators don't have that muscle memory of being curious and challenging and objecting in appropriate ways. I also think the system carries a very heavy weight on people who challenge or openly object to doing things the way they've always been done. Mm-hmm. And so it does require, I think, someone in a room to either A, have courage, or B, invite people to do it. Let me give you an example of that. I was in a meeting, a pretty high level meeting the other day, and someone presented kind of an idea or a couple of different ideas. And the hippo, the highest paid person of the organization sitting in the room, said, okay, let's take a pause. Let's talk about this idea. And I'm going to offer some feedback and go. And when people started to get a little defensive, he said, let's stop with the defensiveness and let's talk about this productively. So we talked about our language and how we were using it, but it was the invitation to say hey, I'm going to give some feedback here. I know that could be uncomfortable, but let's talk about whether, and eventually we arrived at this idea was the best version of what we had moving forward with a few small tweaks. But my point was it took someone of some reasonable hierarchy, bureaucracy, whatever you call it, to say, we are going to talk about this openly. We're not going to just sit here and say, yeah, this looks great and move on. Let's work through it. That I think is not something I've seen a ton of.
So it's the takeaway is the power structures that are embedded in the culture will oftentimes determine which path, left or right, one takes when it comes to being compliant or curious. Interesting.
I also think that it's hard because the system is designed with the past. We've talked about this before, that it's a perpetuation of the past, that when you think about the things that you're learning, very, very few teachings anymore are processes, right? Or not anymore, ever, right? Most of it is content that memorize this thing, memorize this information, remember this, regurgitate, and then design, or read this book that was written a long time ago about a time period that doesn't exist anymore, and then tell me what you think about it. There's not a lot of that actively curious part in how we teach even, let alone how we design and how we design, whether it's classroom level or systems level. It's almost like it's all been decided, is how it feels, Randy, oftentimes to me.
Earlier in the week, the connection I made is you had talked about how we tend to see things very much through a black and white lens, right? And when you ask somebody, tell me more or help me to understand it, what it does is it, in my opinion, somewhat removes the need for something to be right or wrong. The tendency, I'm going to own it, is that when someone like goes at something or says something, I'm interjecting to either prove fault or to prove it's like an attempt to poke holes in the dam or whatever. And it is ultimately meant to try to get to a better place, but in the least curious and empathetic way possible. Right. Mm-hmm. So the intention is maybe good, but the way we get there is not about uncovering or things being emergent. It's a very different approach. And so when you ask the question about muscle memory, I think it's just coming down to creating a habit. And that habit is when you're presented with an idea or you're presented with something and you feel a tinge of objection, ask the question, tell me more about that, or help me to understand more what you're thinking, as opposed to the desire to prove wrong. Because I think it uncovers the mindset, the thinking, the root cause, or it helps the person who's formed those opinions or ideas to explore their own thinking and get to a different place. So I don't think that we practice that. Let me say this. I know I don't practice that nearly enough, although I know I want to get better at it. I don't think that the muscle memory is a hard skill for people to learn, but I think it is something that you have to be intentional about. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I know I took up a lot of airspace.
No, that's okay. And I know we're going to wrap this up in 15 seconds, but just one more thought. And that is, I do wonder what the intersection of the behavior of being compliant or curious and choosing that and the relationship too. Like, I would feel much more comfortable being an objector with you guys than I would with two strangers walking down the street. So I think the relationship piece is something that should probably be chatted about at some point too.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
Hey guys, love the conversation tonight. Thank you so much. For those of you who are out there watching and listening, we certainly invite you to join the conversation at thehuman.school. Again, you can access the Mindshift cards from our website, which are really designed to engage one another in these really rich conversations. So again, visit thehuman.school and our conversations page for additional examples of these kinds of conversations. And please join us in committing to placing humanity at the center of all design. Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.